Herstory. I'm Diana Bailey, Executive Director of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. And our guest today is Dr. Rita Robinson. Good afternoon, I'm Diana Bailey and welcome to Herstory. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, and today my special guest is Dr. Rita Robinson. Dr. Robinson has had a very long history in terms of women's issues, education, and educational equity. So we're thrilled to have you here today, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about Herstory and your work.
I don't really know where to begin about it, but I guess I'd like to focus on being an educator. Okay.
It's a special one.
Yeah, very special one, and as well as being a counselor, therapist counselor in my own private practice. As an educator, you know, I guess I was always interested in teaching. That's my basic love. I love to teach. Currently, I'm an adjunct professor at Bowie State University, teaching in the graduate department. But as the oldest child of 7, I just kind of fell into the whole avenue of just teaching. I taught all my sisters, and when they started school, they just knew how to begin because I taught them. And then I was a teacher.
Were you always in Prince George's County?
No, I started out in Washington, D.C. Okay, started out in D.C. That's my home. I still have a home there. Moved to Prince George's County in the early 70s. Came here as a counselor because I was a teacher in D.C. And then from my experience as a counselor, I was a pupil personnel worker, which basically is like a social worker in the schools today. I was vice principal of a school, elementary school, for a number of years, and held director positions for many areas in the county, pupil services, equity, staff development, and those kinds of things.
I know Title IX was in there as well.
Title IX, early 90s. In fact, Prince George's County was one of the first school systems to have an official Title IX person, and I happen to have been that person. Title IX has always been really dear to my heart. I think so many people think about Title IX in terms of sports, but Title IX in my sphere of expertise was actually in education. Right. Was looking at, women and those courses like traditionally didn't have women in them. Many of them were the high-level math courses, or many of them were the AP classes. So making sure, and also looking at that through an equity lens, where we talked about girls and boys getting into those programs.
But not about educational equity.
Yeah. Not only getting them into there, but also giving them the support to be successful. So there was a lot of that I did as the equity officer for the county.
I heard you say you started in the 70s.
Yes.
And what was the school climate and the culture in the 70s in Prince George's County like, as maybe compared to today?
Very different, very different. But in a way, it's almost like a revolving circle, because in many ways, it's back to where it used to be in the 70s. When I came in the 70s, I came during that time when Prince George's County was really beginning to integrate their schools. And I came as a counselor, and at that time, we had two schools. Counselors were in actually two schools, and one of my main jobs was really helping with that whole integration kind of a thing. And so that was an interesting and a challenging time, but I have to say I enjoyed it. I've always enjoyed my experience with education. Really and truly, when you think about it today, we're almost back again because so many of the schools are segregated again.
Just by geography.
Yeah, just right.
It's
So,
like,
you know, we went through that real big phase, a whole lot of human relations teaching, a whole lot of working with teachers talking about diversity. And we still do talk about diversity a lot and talk about, you know, the whole idea of the isms in our schools. But we're also kind of, well, I guess, taking a step backwards in terms of what many of our schools are today.
So now that I know you're not retired because you work a lot with the Women's Heritage Center, but what's your new encore career, would you say, now that you're an experienced professional or a professional educator and using all this wise woman wisdom that you have?
Well, you know, I guess that's what happens when you live long enough. You get a little bit of wisdom, you know. But I retired officially in 2005. And of course, my husband always says, don't tell anybody you retired in 2005 because you really haven't. But
It's within 10 years, right? You're not retired.
It gave me the opportunity to do some of the things that I really wanted to do. Basically, really working on my own business, Creative Learning Enterprises. Getting that going, although we had established it in the early 80s, didn't do a whole lot because I was working.
Just busy, sure.
So being able to really focus on that, with doing some human resource services, products and teaching, being able to establish my own private practice, that has really been self-fulfilling.
Mostly with youth or adults or a combination?
Mainly, it's a combination, but mainly focusing on couples.
Oh, okay.
So a whole lot of couples, married couples, couples otherwise, you know, same couples, you know, but it's been fascinating, and it has made me really take courses, do a lot of reading and working with them. So that's been a wonderful thing. Also having the opportunity to work with school systems, you know, with Creative Learning Enterprises. You know, had a contract with Baltimore City Public Schools. Really interesting one where we worked with families, helping families to really be a part of how to navigate the system, in other words, so that they would be, you know, more knowledgeable and how they could get the things that they wanted to get.
So be more at self-advocacy,
right,
those kinds of things.
Right. And then for Prince George's County, I worked with that county. My company did work with them in terms of helping to retain teachers. You know, teachers, especially new teachers, they come and they get so overwhelmed and so frustrated. Many of them want to leave within the first 2 years. Sure. So how can you give them support? So we help, you know, support those teachers that way. Had a job with St. Mary's County Public Schools, which was very interesting. We worked with the then superintendent, who's not superintendent now, but just did an in-depth kind of review of how he saw himself and how the community saw him.
It was about community relations,
yes,
a lot of it.
And really sort of verifying what he thought was happening in the system against how other people saw him. We were able to give that kind of information feedback back to him.
Well, I know in a lot of your equity work, where do you think that passion came from? Was it from your family? Was it from your community? Was it because you were the oldest child, so you just had to get everything organized? Or where'd that message come from?
Sure. I've always been a person who's thought about equity issues, you know. And I know a lot of times people get equity and fairness mixed up, you know, and that's always been a problem with me, you know. It was always the thing about, you know, treat everybody the same. And in reality, you can't treat everybody the same. In fact, you wouldn't want to treat everybody the same. And I remember my little kids in first and second grade, you know, when somebody would say, this is not fair. And, you know, and I would try to use that principle with young people to say, you know, well, it's not fair, but it's also, we want to look at equity. For instance, if you have a classroom of kids and you have one child who is coughing, who's got a sore throat. So Of course, we can't give medicine to children, but I use this as an example.
Mhm.
So I'm going to give Mary cough syrup, and other people, or cough drops. Other children might say, well, I'd like a cough drop too, but you don't need it.
I need it.
So, you know, what do you look at when you look at equity?
Mhm.
And that's an issue that so many adults have a problem with, you know. If you're working with a population that has been downtrodden, who had not had the services, but they need something, so you give it to them, you don't necessarily give it to the people who already have it. So that's been something that I've always
It seems so
worked
simple,
with.
doesn't it?
It does, but it rubs you wrong. It seems to rub people wrong because they don't understand that principle or that concept. And of course, a lot of people do, but it's very difficult, and especially if you're talking about money.
Right,
You know,
right.
talking about money issues to me becomes a really big problem.
Mhm.
You know, people begin to say, you know, well, why are they getting it and why not me?
Mhm.
I don't need it, that kind of thing.
Right.
So that's always been an issue. You know, one of the other things that I've always been working, I'm doing a lot of work now on domestic violence.
Mhm.
A lot of work with churches,
Mhm.
with organizations on.
Now, you're working with the counselors that provide the services, or the actual folks that have been
Working
victims?
with, no, well, I work with the victims when I do my counseling.
Okay.
Okay, when I do my counseling, I'm working with many people who are experiencing domestic violence. In fact, one of the organizations that I do work for right now is called Still I Rise.
Mhm.
And that's an organization, a wonderful organization in Prince George's County that only deals with domestic violence victims.
Mhm.
And so I'm a part of that. I usually work with them usually on Monday and Tuesday. But I also do workshops. You know, churches will ask to do a workshop on domestic violence. For instance, I just did one with a Catholic church on domestic violence, kind of looking at that whole incident, you know, how do we stop it? And of course, a lot of people, you know, saying, you know, has domestic violence, is that an issue that's just rising? And, you know, but it's one of those issues that people are now more aware of.
Mhm.
So I would say personally that it's not a new issue at all, but it's certainly an issue that we now focusing on, people looking at their behaviors.
Right. I've heard too that the how the clients look are different. There's more men now, I understand, and also there's a lot of international women that are coming in.
Well, that's not so much the domestic violence, or we do have that. Well, domestic violence is not only violence against women,
Mhm.
but it's also violence against men. But the women, of course, are really outnumbered.
The predominant,
Right,
sure.
right. And then we talk about the whole human trafficking issue,
Mhm.
which is sort of like a kind of a segue, not a segue, but an intersection a lot of
Yeah.
times.
Mhm.
So we've been doing a lot of work with human trafficking.
Mhm.
And in fact, I'm on the Prince George's County Task Force for domestic violence, as well as the Prince George's County Task Force for human trafficking. So really trying to make people aware, and if you're aware, then you can maybe respond to if you think that you see something. You know, you don't have to know everything, but if you suspect something, there are people that you can call. And there's a lot of literature out there now to help people recognize.
It's so prevalent
trafficking.
everywhere in Maryland and
Yeah.
across the country, unfortunately.
It's interesting because a couple of years ago, I